Afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Anthony Levinson from McMaster University, and I'm here alongside Dr. Richard Sztramko, geriatrician also at McMaster. And as part of our iGeriCare initiative, we're proud to present to you our 19th live event on a difficult and important topic of genetics and dementia. So we do get a lot of questions in the clinic about, is dementia inherited? And today we want to try to address this fairly complex topic to talk a little bit about genes and genetics and what role they play in relation to dementia, and how genetics may affect the risk of developing different types of dementia. So without further ado, Dr. Sztramko, welcome. You're keeping well amidst the pandemic. And why don't we dive into a few of the basics? And I guess just a bit of a caveat today, we're going to do the best we can to explain a complex topic. There are still unknowns about the topics, about the role that genetics plays in the risk of some of the dementias. But we will do our best, and we will also do our best to try to answer some of your questions. Thank you so much for people who've sent in questions over the last couple of weeks. So, Richard, why don't we talk a little bit about the basics of what are genes exactly?
Sure. So genes are a means by which characteristics are passed through different families. Genes are located at specific locations on chromosomes, and you can see the picture of the chromosome there. We have 46 chromosomes. Each of us inherit 23 from our biologic mothers and 23 from our biologic fathers. And on specific locations, you'll have an area of DNA that's responsible for providing messages to the cell to create certain types of proteins that help it function. And so those proteins might be enzymes, or they might be structural proteins, but they have purposes and function within the cell, and all of our cells have different functions within the body. So, genes are found in almost every cell in the body, and everybody will have two copies of a gene on one of the chromosomes that they inherit from their father or their mother.
And and I guess we'll apologize in advance in terms of, this is a different format than we usually do our live events. So we'll have to roll with the punches in terms of some of the technical issues, as you know. I guess, what do we know at this time about the role that genes play in dementia specifically?
Right. I think it's helpful to break it down into kind of early onset dementias and later onset dementias as well. So there are kind of two types of genes. One is, if you have a copy of that gene, you're almost guaranteed, or you are guaranteed to get the illness. So in Alzheimer's disease, there's something called presenilin 1. We'll get into more of that later on, but if you have a copy, you will get Alzheimer's disease generally earlier on in life. And then there are other genes that, instead of just having one copy, they just increase your likelihood a little bit of developing dementia. And so, there might be 10 or 20 different genes, all of which play a smaller role in increasing your risk. Some, in fact, may decrease your risk. So depending on what combination of those genes you have, plus what takes place in your environment, and perhaps what other medical conditions you have, there's there's an impact of all of those multiple factors interacting with one another. So that's a little bit more.
I think that's a really great distinction, because I think sometimes when people think about genetic disorders, they are just thinking about what we call single gene disorders. You have this genetic disorder like Huntington's, and you get the disease. But the reality for most dementias is quite a bit more complex, and so the genes may confer a risk, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. And I think this is what we see with most conditions, things like hypertension or various kinds of disorders where there's a role that genetics play in relation to your risk of getting it, but it's not like a one-to-one, you've got this gene, you get this disorder.
It kind of takes me back to medical school a little bit when within the first few slides of every presentation on every disease there's a complex interplay between genes and your environment. And Alzheimer's and the other dementias are really no different in that sense.
So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the more common, I guess, genetic variants or things that we know that might be more likely at play, or ones that we know in certain diseases. And then there are certain, more rare ones which might be associated with a much higher risk of developing dementia, but that they occur very infrequently.
Mm-hmm. So I think in Alzheimer's disease, perhaps the ApoE4 is a good example. And generally, that confers risk for late onset disease. So generally, when we talk about late onset dementias, we're talking about people that get dementia after the age of 65. And so we'd say, there are 20 different variants. I think I mentioned that before. That impact people that have the later onset disease. I don't think it's worthwhile to get into them. They all have weird names like clusterin and things like that are not easy to digest. But the most well-known risk factor is ApoE4. And so ApoE4 is one of those genes that takes place at a certain specific spot on one of the chromosomes, and it is responsible for usually transporting lipids or fat within the cell, but it can also contribute to how cells will fold the different types of proteins. And in one of the proteins that it might help to fold or facilitate getting rid of is beta amyloid, which is one of the toxic proteins, A beta 42, that we've discussed, that can cause damage to cells and accumulates outside of the cells. So this is a pattern where if you have one copy of ApoE4, you're heterozygous, your risk will increase 2 to 4 times. If you're homozygous, you have 2 copies, it can increase between 8 and 12 times. So that's a significant increase, right? Like an 8 to 12 times risk if you're a homozygote is quite substantial. And so that means that if you're a homozygote, and you'll have a 50% chance of developing Alzheimer's disease by the time you reach age 80. Whereas, most of the numbers would suggest, 20% chance of developing a dementia by the time you reach 80. So it substantially increases your risk throughout your lifespan in older age.
And I would say at the moment, is it fair to say that the ApoE gene and the ApoE4 variant, that's sort of our best known sort of risk for increasing your risk of developing the sort of typical late onset Alzheimer's disease?
Absolutely. And I think it's very clear because it's a dose-dependent mechanism, meaning if you have one copy, it's a certain risk, and if you have 2 copies, it's an even greater risk. So very easy.
It's still a risk. And I think, as you were saying, it's still a risk. It's not necessarily 100% that you're going to develop it, or 100% that you're going to develop it at a younger age, just that your risk is increased. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay,
yeah, and so they're much more common variants. So, ApoE2 and ApoE3 happen more frequently than ApoE4. And just to give you context, 1 in every 50 people will inherit 2 copies of ApoE4. So it's a very small number of people. But over the population, it can definitely add up.
So let's talk a little bit about young onset dementia, because I think, or even young onset Alzheimer's disease, because sometimes we get questions from people who maybe have a family member who have developed young onset. So I guess roughly how common is young onset Alzheimer's disease, and is it associated with any particular genetics?
Absolutely. So it's much less common. So 1 in 100 people that develop Alzheimer's disease will have a genetic mutation or variant that's associated with early onset Alzheimer's disease. So the most common genetic variants that are associated with this are amyloid precursor protein, presenilin 1 and presenilin 2. Presenilin 1 is the most common variant associated with early onset Alzheimer's disease. They were first discovered sometime in the 1990s, and then a few of them were picked up shortly thereafter. And so basically, amyloid precursor protein is what it says. It's a precursor to the A beta 42 and many other variants of amyloid that get processed and eventually accumulate outside of the cell and cause damage to the cells. So the mutation in this case allows it to be cleaved by the different enzymes within the cell and actually cause increased levels of A beta 42. And so that's how that takes place. And presenilin also happens in a similar mechanism, but instead of it being a mutation in the actual cleavage sites, it has mutations in the enzymes, which will cause them to process the amyloid in a different fashion and increase the amount of amyloid that takes place there too.
So,
and presenilin is quite rare.
I mean, these things, as we've talked about, can get pretty complicated in a hurry, and there's still quite a bit that's not fully understood. But basically, it seems like these genes might increase the amount of toxic proteins, and the toxic proteins might lead to cell death and brain areas to be compromised. Is that the simple approach to?
I think that's a very excellent summary and more appropriate than what I said for our audience. So thanks for definitely kind of bringing it together there.
I think the reality is that there are still a lot of unknowns, but we do know that, and for example, people with extra copies of amyloid precursor protein, for example, in trisomy 21, one of the more common forms of Down syndrome, there's extra copies of amyloid precursor protein, and there's a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's dementia at a younger age, and we think it's related to their extra copy of that.
Absolutely. And
what about? Sorry, go ahead.
So instead of people developing Alzheimer's disease at a later age, most commonly after 65, the average age of onset for presenilin 1 is 45. So it's much earlier. And in rarer cases, people can develop Alzheimer's disease in their 20s or 30s, depending on what type of mutation. And even within the different mutations we're discussing, it's not like presenilin 1 only has one mutation. It gets to be very complicated. So there's a whole spectrum of illness there. And because people are accumulating the amyloid more rapidly, they'll also have kind of more aggressive features associated with the illness. So sometimes, they might have seizures or things of that nature. Cerebral amyloid angiopathy, we haven't really talked about, but they do look a little bit different than people that get Alzheimer's disease at a later age. And this is one of the scenarios. So when we're talking about these young, early onset dementias, well, specifically Alzheimer's disease, are the autosomal dominant pattern, where if you do have that copy of this gene or the variant of this gene, then you will develop Alzheimer's disease. So it's much easier to trace the pattern throughout families in that sense, because it's a one copy illness paradigm as opposed to 10 or 20 different genes that you'd have to look at to understand somebody's risk. So you can track it. It's much easier for families.
It's just fair to say, again, that those families with these kinds of very young onset dementia are very rare. But the most common scenarios that we encounter are those where age is the biggest risk factor, and some more subtle genetics is probably conferring some increase in risk. But these families with younger onset Alzheimer's that are strongly inherited are absolutely the exceptions or the rarer forms.
Absolutely. And, I think that's really important to get across for the purposes of changing people's behaviors for our lifestyle discussions as well. So just because you have a genetically increased risk doesn't mean that doing things like exercising and stopping smoking and limiting your alcohol consumption and managing your high blood pressure and diabetes won't help. I think that's really important also. So they play a big risk. So they play a big part, but there's lots of modifiable variables in almost all cases of dementia.
I'm going to, we have some other things that we thought we might talk about in terms of some of the other types of dementias, and each one of those types of dementias may have certain genetics that are involved, but we're getting some really good questions coming in. So I'm gonna switch over and we'll take some questions, and if we have time, we can talk a bit more about some of the genetic issues related to a few of the other common causes of dementia. So here's a question that came in. I've had various genetic testing. My mom and cousin have Alzheimer's disease. Can I be tested?
So you can, it depends on the different types of tests that you can do, right? You can have whole genome sequencing done. You can have the external tests like 23andMe and those things done. But the challenge, you can have your ApoE4 done. So, you can be tested for all of those different things. Most of the other genes that we talked about, the 10 to 20 different variants, you'd have to be in some sort of research study to get done. And from a clinical point of view, in the office, counseling people on risk, with just that history of some first degree relatives, we'd say, well, you do have an increased risk of developing dementia, and that would be predicated on what specific subtype is there. But we don't know how to quantify what that risk is. We don't know how to tell you for certain, even if there is a gene there, that you will definitely get it because it's not autosomal dominant. So I think the challenge with testing is we get a result back. We don't know whether or not you are going to develop an illness. So how do we approach that, or how are we going to change things based on the information that we get back? So I think it's in the challenge.
Yeah, I guess it's fair to say in the normal way, if somebody presents with the later onset form, it's very unusual for us to do any genetic testing. I think, as you say, it's sort of, if you have a super strong family history and young onset, and it seems to be following an obvious genetic pattern and younger onset, then you may get tested as part of sort of a genetics workup. But it is rare that we do genetic tests in older onset.
Yeah. And even, and we talked more, I guess, in the FTD spectrum, so the frontotemporal degeneration, kind of bringing that in. There's actually a higher percentage of cases in FTD, which encompasses the behavioral variant, frontotemporal dementia, some of the language variants, as well as some movement disorders that mimic Parkinson's in certain ways, so progressive supranuclear palsy and corticobasal syndrome. Up to 10% of those cases are actually inherited and have much stronger genetic patterns as well. The average age of onset for FTD is 58. So that means that you will get a bit more overlap with older patients, that you'd be more inclined to do genetic testing with FTD. But, anytime any testing is to be done, we recommend going to a genetic counselor first to understand what are the implications of that test? What do they mean, not only for me, but for everybody else in my family? If I get a positive result back and I'm disclosing this, but I have a very low risk of developing a dementia, then I'm causing a lot of suffering and harm and worry in advance. So it's really important information that you're going to get back from the test. I reemphasize again, we don't recommend testing for most people unless there's a defined pattern of inheritance that's very strong. And if there is any testing that's going to be done, I'm not going to do that directly. I'm going to refer to a genetic counselor that understands all of the ins and outs of the various tests and what it means not only to the person that has dementia who is affected, but other people who don't have dementia and might not ever be affected.
Here's another question. My father passed away from Alzheimer's disease. My mother has dementia. My brother believes that lack of sleep is a contributor. Is that right?
So it means sleep and dementia is kind of a two-way street in that the toxic proteins do impair different parts of the brain. So not only is your memory impaired because of the hippocampus, but there are other sleep regulation centers where the toxic protein also impacts what's happening. So having Alzheimer's disease certainly does alter your sleep architecture and puts you at increased risk of having things like seizures. So Alzheimer's impacts sleep. But what we found is that there are kind of a daily variation in the levels of the amyloid protein in the fluid around the brain, so the cerebrospinal fluid. And those are impacted by sleep. And there's been animal models where if you dysregulate sleep in mice, that they're more likely to accumulate the toxic beta amyloid protein as well. So Alzheimer's impacts your sleep function, but having poor sleep can impact the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. And again, we don't know what that means. Certainly some people run on different, requirements for sleep. Some people might only need 5 or 6 hours, and maybe some people need 10. So it's not like you can say just because you're not sleeping, you're at this hugely increased risk. We don't know what the dose response is yet. So, but there's certainly an association there.
Yeah, and I would say that what you just described seems there's that kind of association, which could even be a vicious cycle in a few other components. It's like exercise or mobility. People with, we think of exercise potentially being helpful, but dementia may lower your mobility and activity, and then less mobility and activity may worsen cognition. It might be the same story with a few other things as well, where there's an association, but it's hard to know the cause and effect.
Absolutely.
We've got another interesting question. Does epilepsy increase the probability of dementia?
It's another one of those things. So I'm not a neurologist, and I'm not an epileptologist. So I'm not a seizure doctor. Having Alzheimer's disease, because of what we just mentioned before, the toxic proteins impacting the brain does increase your risk of developing epilepsy or seizures. I know there is some evidence suggesting that persistent ongoing abnormal electrical activity in the brain can cause more permanent damage. It's one of the reasons why you want to control that activity. But I'm not sure how to quantify the risk. Or let's say you had epilepsy for 30 or 40 years. I don't know what that risk is.
And certainly other types of dementias, like vascular dementia, that might be associated with multiple strokes, multiple small strokes. The strokes can also act as a focus for seizures. So it's possible that the person has vascular dementia and seizures. This question's hard to address because is it a young person or somebody who has epilepsy? I think it's not necessarily well known, but probably if the epilepsy is well controlled and well managed, it might not necessarily increase a risk of dementia, but it probably depends.
Right.
Here's another question about, could young onset Alzheimer's disease be caused by trauma?
Not generally. Not frequently. I don't know of any cases where trauma would cause it. You'd have traumatic brain injury where that that trauma causes damage to the brain, and sometimes there's the trauma may cause a bleed, and so that area of the brain may actually die or need to be taken out. And if that takes place, then there's permanent damage because there's actually brain death there. There's also temporary brain impairment. People that have concussions or have had severe concussions can have a post-concussive syndrome where for periods of time they have headaches and feel dizzy and have some cognitive impairment. But that's reversible. In terms of, there is an association with having a traumatic brain injury and losing consciousness and late onset dementia, but not an early onset dementia. I've not heard of any cases of that happening where you have head trauma and you start accumulating toxic beta amyloid or tau. I've never heard of that.
I guess some occupations like being a boxer, where you might sustain chronic trauma to the brain, might lead to what we call chronic traumatic encephalopathy or CTE, and that can be associated with cognitive impairments and personality and behavior changes.
That makes sense. Sorry, I didn't read the question though. Was it early onset Alzheimer's disease specifically?
Yeah, it was really young onset Alzheimer's. So I think the notion is
yes to CTE, definitely.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges with dementia, as we've often said, is an umbrella, and we don't always get a definitive diagnosis. We take our best guess based on the characteristics and the history and the physical exam and investigations, but we can't always know 100% what the underlying cause was. And that probably also influences our understanding of the genetics. If we might make a clinical diagnosis of one type of dementia based on the appearance and the features, but somebody might get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or told they have young onset dementia, but they might actually have dementia due to another cause. My husband has Alzheimer's, 83 years old, onset at 80. Of 5 siblings, 4 have had onset at age 80. Are genetics at play here?
I mean, that's a very interesting, strong family history that would make me question whether genetics are at play for sure. And so, whether there is an inheritance pattern of some of the less strongly associated diseases, or potentially whether, there is ApoE present in that family, it does sound like it could be a contributing factor. Certainly a much higher risk than if only one of their brothers or sisters had it. One of the other things I would kind of caution, and you mentioned this earlier, I believe, Anthony, is that genetics for high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease also run in families as well. And so there could have been a clustering of vascular risk. So I know that person had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, but it's really challenging to know what the actual damage to the brain is caused by. And so it's also possible that, they all had cerebrovascular or, narrowing of the arteries in the brain, or high blood cholesterol or hypertension, and that could have contributed as well.
I want to pick up on some of what we just talked about with vascular dementia. We had a viewer send in a question during the week. Can a 90% blockage of a carotid artery, those are the large arteries that pump the blood up to the brain in the neck, can a 90% blockage of a carotid artery be the cause of dementia?
Yeah, not frequently. It wouldn't be just that 90% blockage. The biggest risk of having a 90% blockage of the carotid artery is a substantially increased risk of an embolic stroke. So a blood clot forming on that narrowing, or the plaque that's in the carotid artery rupturing and having a stroke travel up to or having a blood clot rather travel up from that narrowing area into the brain and causing a stroke. And so anytime there's a narrowing greater than 70%, there's a substantial increased risk of having a stroke. Realistically, there are other states where people can have significant narrowing of the arteries, not only in the carotids, but also within the blood vessels in the brain, and can sometimes have a low flow state. So just how, or similarly, when you're walking and you have narrowing of your heart arteries, you might have chest pain that shows that you're not getting enough oxygen to the heart. There are certain low flow states in certain areas of the brain that could contribute to cognitive impairment. Also, that association is not strongly linked. So the answer to your question is very unlikely that narrowing is causing a dementia. The other thing you'd consider as well is it's only on one side of the brain that you'd likely have this impacted. And so you have certain, muscle functions or nerve sensing functions that might be impacted, but dementia is generally a more global process that focuses on cognitive dysfunction. So you're not picking up on it based on only one area. The most common presentation would be a stroke.
Also, the body and the brain tends to compensate if the blockage of the carotid happens slowly over time. We sort of tend to sprout new blood vessels to compensate if we have time. But as Richard's saying, if it may put you at increased risk for a stroke, or it may be suggestive of other issues going on with other arteries. But often when a blockage like that occurs, if it happens slowly over time, the brain and the body do compensate in terms of the flow of blood to the other parts of. That's a great another question. My maternal aunt has Alzheimer's disease. Another maternal aunt has vascular dementia, and maternal uncle had Lewy body dementia. What are the risks of me getting some type of dementia?
The answer is I have no idea. Because and really that's the challenge, is that there is some overlap between people getting Alzheimer's disease and vascular disease. There's lots of actually overlap between people having Alzheimer's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies at the same time, but I'm not aware of any genetic predisposition that causes a clustering of vascular dementia with Lewy bodies, and Alzheimer's disease within the same family. So unfortunately, we can't answer that.
Yeah, one of the, and again, as we talked about, there's sort of common disorders, and then there's relatively rare disorders. If you add up all of the rare disorders, there's actually quite a lot of them. So there are actually societies devoted to rare disorders, because cumulatively, many, many people suffer from relatively rare disorders. So one of the things, like I work periodically with an expert who works with a type of disease called mitochondrial disease. And, 20, 30 years ago, people didn't appreciate that the mitochondria had their own DNA, and that the mitochondrial DNA could have genetic issues with it that would potentially cause all kinds of different nerve and muscle diseases. But, this is one of the things that comes to mind when you talk about this strong maternal history, is whether or not there is, because mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally. So it's possible that there's a sort of rare disorder of the mitochondria that's being passed on, and it's leading to different nerve and muscle problems. The range of different kinds of illnesses that mitochondrial diseases are associated with is quite vast, quite varied. So hard to know, and I guess it just highlights some of the complexity around that. Here's another viewer question that was sent in this week. My husband was diagnosed with dementia at 80. He's still living at home with me, some vascular, but likely Alzheimer's because of symptoms, memory, and cognitive loss. He is the youngest of 6. 2 brothers and 1 sister, deceased, all developed the disease around age 80. 1 sister, deceased, developmentally challenged, died at 82, and the oldest brother died at 78 of heart disease and cancer. 4 out of 6 with dementia. Our genetics at play here. This is reminiscent of the other family that had later onset, but just a lot of people in the family. 4 out of 5 in the other question, 4 out of 6 in this question.
Yeah, and I would give the same answer. It definitely suggests that there is something going on there. With that many people at play, the probability would, suggest it. But what the specific underlying cause would be, I wouldn't know.
It may well be the case that ApoE4 could be a factor here, given that that's the one that we know best. But
yeah, and I mean that's the hard part, right? It's like, I don't know what the probability of ApoE4 being implicated in this family will be. Seems like it would be a higher probability, but that's where it gets to be challenging, is what exactly is going on. And the only way to tease that out, really, and this is what happens, is to have all of the people that have Alzheimer's or frontotemporal dementia at the same time go and get their entire genomes sequenced and find out what the association is between the cognitive presentation that they have and the pathology that exists in their brain, because you can't really tie them together just based on superficially how people look. Somebody might have behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia syndromically, but it's actually caused by Alzheimer's. You have to have the syndrome at play. You have to have actual brain tissue at play. Then you have to do a genetic association or do genetic testing to find out what all of the genes are present and tie those together to make, that association. And it was interesting and new, and, just because we're talking about these different genetic variants right now does not mean that we won't find new genetic variants in the future. So when I was in the middle of my training, I was out at UBC. The lab there did extensive testing along with a bunch of other sites throughout the United States and throughout the world. And they found one of the genes associated with FTD, which is the C9ORF72. It's a complicated name, but that's exactly what they did, and they found all of these associations that take place and put them in their appropriate context. But you need a lot of information to find these genetic variants. And so, maybe it's ApoE4, maybe it's a strong combination of the other illnesses, the other genetic variants that increase your risk slightly for Alzheimer's disease. Maybe it's the vascular risk that's present, or maybe it's some genetic variant that we have yet to discover that's clustered in that family specifically. So, I think of, you just look for a pattern as well. So presenilin 2, I think, was like can't remember it's like a Volga Germanic people that was a familial disorder, and they found it in these people. And there was a strong element that, sounded like it was genetic, and they did all of these tests, and that's how they discovered the presenilin 2 gene. So it'd be very interesting to do research, but if they've passed on, then and there's no brain banking, then it's too late.
My father, younger sister, and brother have dementia. And so my father, younger sister, and brother all have dementia. Should I advise my adult child to get genetic testing? And
I mean, that would be a question that I would pose to a genetic counselor if you're really interested. We don't recommend genetic testing for anybody outside of research purposes right now, again, because you don't know what you would do with the results. And you don't know what the conferred increased risk is. So generally the line is we don't recommend it. If somebody's very interested or very keen on it, then they should have a really detailed formal assessment with a genetic counselor. And just a caution as well is, we mentioned it in the different types of dementia, but there are very specific patterns of cognitive deficits. And so just because people are having some memory and thinking problems does not mean that they have Alzheimer's disease caused by A beta 42 and tau, and does not mean that there's going to be a genetic association there. So if they haven't seen a dementia specialist, so whether it's a geriatric psychiatrist or a neuropsychiatrist or a geriatrician or a family doctor that's very well versed in diagnosing it. Sometimes the diagnosis of just having Alzheimer's disease can be dubious as well. So it's important, I think, if you're going to go for any genetic testing, to narrow down, this particular pattern of cognitive deficits and potentially, some MRI findings and things like that, to be more confident or precise with a diagnosis.
Here's another very difficult to answer question. It's not impossible. Over half of my father's family developed dementia in their late 70s. How likely is it that I will develop dementia?
Yeah, I mean, I think with those first degree relatives, again, it's like a significant increase from the baseline population, but the baseline population risk being relatively low at this stage. And so I wouldn't recommend, I don't know I can't quantify what that person's risk is specifically.
And this is where what we talked about before in terms of other lifestyle factors, blood vessel health, your risk based on the family history may be slightly increased, but there may have been things that were different about your father's family in terms of those lifestyle factors and that interplay, which is very complex, between genetics and sort of lifestyle medicine or those kind of lifestyle behaviors, sleep, diet, exercise. We have an incomplete understanding of the interactions between all of those things.
Yes, I definitely use those I use the presence of medical illness in my family to motivate me to make all the lifestyle changes that I can. And I think that's the strongest thing that everybody can do. If there's a known presence of early onset heart disease or coronary artery disease in your family, then make sure you're getting your cholesterol tested and make sure your blood pressure is well controlled, and be eating right and be exercising and doing all the things you can to modify your risk. So I think that's a strong message for anybody that has a strong family history. Is now is the time, especially as you're approaching midlife and in midlife, is to really get serious about all those things.
I guess fundamentally we think about modifiable risk factors and unmodifiable ones, and in most cases we cannot necessarily modify our genes, and it may be over time that we understand some of the interactions. Like maybe it's the case that doing this kind of lifestyle behavior has more impact with certain kind of genetic risk variants, but at the end of the day, right now, we don't have that kind of blueprint that says, oh, you're this genetic variant, you should focus on cognitive training, or you should focus on exercise. So mostly for most of the modifiable risk factors, the things that we recommend are good for your general overall health, and they're also probably good for your brain health, and they may diminish any risk that is related to unmodifiable ones like your genetics that you probably can't change at this time. Maybe in 50 years, we'll be able to edit some of those genes, but not now.
Yeah. And I do think it's interesting, there over the last 5 years, but somewhat less so now, has been the panacea, or the solution to everything was going to be personalized medicine, and in particular in oncology studies and trials. And there's certain predispositions to having side effects from medications and stuff like that, but having your whole genome sequenced and understanding exactly how to treat you with exercise and medications and all the different things hasn't come to fruition yet. So, this is the best that we have at this time.
Yeah. Well, any other final words before we wrap up related to a complex topic? I think this is one that many people have asked about. We didn't get to talk about all of the other types of disorders, some of the other dementias and their relationships. So maybe we'll have another episode, another live event on genetics where we can talk about those, is certainly, it's also a good topic to circle back to in future, just because it is an evolving area. But any final words?
I think just mentioning the frontotemporal dementia variants. So we mentioned the C9ORF72. There's something called MAP-T and progranulin. And the reason, just because there's such a strong association and a larger number of the cases of people that have FTD are caused by genetic mutations. So 1 in 100 Alzheimer's cases, where it's 10 out of 100 FTD cases, and potentially more if we study it a little bit more in depth. And if you kind of understand the Alzheimer's disease paradigm and the FTD paradigm, those are the most important ones, because the genetic associations for vascular, for Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, they're much less. So yeah, I think that's it. And then back to the importance. I think we get a question on genetics in every single live event or every, presentation that we give in person. So definitely worthwhile to understand or attempt to. And then also the disclaimer again that, I'm not a geneticist nor a genetic counselor. So, and neither are you. So it's there could be more in-depth and granular discussions to be had about all of these topics. And so hopefully if there's anything that's sparked somebody's curiosity or interest, they'll, go and read further or get in contact with a genetic counselor if there's a really strong family history.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richard Sztramko.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful to have you join us today. Hope your family continues to be safe. And just a reminder, iGeriCare was developed with support from the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, powered by Baycrest, the Jarrett Center at Hamilton Health Sciences, McMaster University, the Hamilton Health Sciences Foundation, the Alzheimer's Society Foundation of Hamilton Halton, and our Division of E-Learning Innovation team. Just a reminder as well to donate if you enjoyed today's live event and are a fan of our lessons and live events on iGeriCare.ca. Donations do help us to continue to bring you the kind of programming through our live events, as well as new lessons. Look for a new multimedia lesson on the horizon that is in final production. You can donate through the iGeriCare.ca site. There's a donate button on the top right corner of the website. Our next live event is coming in Thursday, June 25th at 1 p.m. I think we can be pretty confident that it will likely be through this format again. The survey is pinned at the top of the comment section, so please vote for your favorite topic, give us some feedback, and as always, teamwork makes the dream work. Stay safe, everybody, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.